Hey, what's up YouTube? Steven here with Rabbit Hobbies. So last week I put out a video showing you how I paint Skaven fast without sacrificing quality. These Skaven clan rats are an example of the type of quality you can expect using this method to paint your Skaven fast. This method I like to call rat chop. In the last video, I showed you how to use the rat chop method for painting Skaven using a brush only. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use an airbrush to make rat chop even faster. An airbrush isn't something that you have to have, but man does it make everything go quick. You can use it for priming, you can use it for varnishing, for base coating, you can use it for details, you can use it for zenithal highlighting. My favorite reason to have an airbrush though is it allows you to paint an entire army fast. If you haven't seen the first part, be sure to check out part 1. I might go a little fast in this video, and that's because I don't want to repeat myself for people that have already watched the first one. Here my clan rat is all primed and ready, which I did use my airbrush for. For my base coat, I'll be using Pro Acryl Shadow Flash from Monument Hobbies. I always start with a couple drops of Flow Improver. This ensures that the paint flows well and without clogging. I also use airbrush thinner. Back in the day I used to use Windex, and I've also used water before, but I found the bespoke thinner actually works better for this. Adding 3 drops of Flow Improver. Then I add my paint. Not much because it's just this one mini. Also, I find Monument Hobbies paints do not require very much thinning for the airbrush. Give it a quick stir. Now I'm doing just an all-over base coat. This layer should be very thin and just enough to cover. Next we'll be doing a zenithal highlight of Tan Flesh by Pro Acryl. Some Flow Improver. Just a tiny bit of thinner. Now for this step we're spraying from about 45 degrees above the model. Our goal here is to base coat the upper surfaces while preserving the shadows beneath. We'll be covering about 75% of the model this way. Next I'm using my sponge, my dry palette, my texture palette, because we're going to be dry brushing. I'm using a cheap makeup brush that you can get at the dollar store, and using some paper towel to wipe off excess paint. For paint we'll be using Pale Pink by Pro Acryl. Getting a little bit of moisture on my sponge. First getting our bristles damp and our sponge, and then we're going to be loading up our paint. And then wiping away excess paint on the paper towel, and then testing on our dry palette to make sure it's coming off the way we want it. Once it's looking good, we're going to be dry brushing in a downward motion and also across any edges of texture. The goal here is to pre-shade the model so that our Army Painter speed paint will look even better in the next step. Next, we're breaking out our fidget palette for our speed paint. And for this next step, we're going to be filling up our palette with all the colors we'll be using to save time. For the wood, we'll be using Fire Drake. For the fur, we're using Ruddy Fur. For all of the flesh, we'll be using Crusader Skin. For all of our metals, we'll be using Broadsword Silver. For our belts, we'll be using Sand Golem. And for our cloaks, we'll be using Poppy Red. Now I'm going to be working across my palette left to right. First I'm painting in all of the wood on the shield, both front and back, along with the weapon. I do my best to be neat here, but it doesn't have to be perfect. The silver will cover over the brown. When working with speed paint, it's really important to find the right balance of paint on your brush for 2 reasons. One, you want to prevent the paint from getting into the ferrule and fouling your bristles. The ferrule is the metal part that clamps the bristles onto the handle of the brush. And second, you want to make sure you don't overload it because it runs quite easily and you don't want it to run into places you don't want the paint to go. Next, we're using Ruddy Fur to paint all the furry bits. Pay attention to the arms, armpits, any gaps in the robes, their beards, and anywhere on the legs where the fur extends down. Don't worry if there's a somewhat harsh edge between the fur and the skin. That's going to be taken care of in the next step and further on. Speed paint really shines on heavily textured models. They work wonderfully for Skaven with all the fur, the robes. I find that speed paint doesn't work as well on things like Stormcast Eternals or Space Marines where there's large flat surfaces. Conversely, other armies almost feel made for speed paint, armies like Tyranids or anything Nurgle. Okay, the wood and the fur is all done. We're moving on to our skin with Crusader skin. We're going to slap this all over the fleshy bits of the model, and I'm not very careful with this step because this color is very subtle, and any subsequent color is actually just going to cover right over it. This, I think, is the fastest step in the whole process because I can just slap it all over. It can be tempting during this stage to overload your brush, but like I said, make sure you don't. You don't want that getting into your ferrule. You also want to maintain a relatively thin amount on there so that you get the stain on the upper levels while it pools into the recesses. Here's how our skin should look after the first 3 layers of speed paint. Now we're moving on to Broadsword Silver for the metals. I like to test the consistency of the paint on the back of my hand just to make sure that it's flowing the way I want. On the edges where it butts up against another color we've already finished is where we want to be really careful about how much paint is actually on our brush. We don't want it to run onto those previous layers. Now that the weapon and the shield is done, we're going to move on to the chainmail underneath the robes. And some of the Skaven actually have collars to paint. This is the part that's probably the most fiddly. Next, we're using Sand Golem to paint the belt and also the hand wraps. Quick test on the back of my hand. I don't worry too much about staying in the lines on this step because similar to the Crusader skin, this is a very light tone and our following tones are going to actually completely cover it over. I do want to make sure that I don't get any onto the Crusader skin from the previous step. Moving on to Poppy Red for the robes. Keep in mind you can use whatever robes color you'd like. You could use green for Clan Pestilence, you could use a bluish tone for Scryer. This method is going to warm up your tones, but that works just fine for Skaven. Poppy Red is an extremely potent pigment, and I'm very careful here to make sure that I don't run outside the lines. This step is the longest step in the painting process. Even so, it still goes very quick. I paint quickly when I'm in the middle of the robe, but as I get close to other colors, I slow down and take care. Anytime using speed paint, like I said, don't overload your brush. Think of it like a coloring book, you're just coloring inside the lines. If I was painting a traditional way like layering, I would be trying to build up a uniform tone here, but actually all the tonal variation is useful, it's going to look great in the end. We want a variety of color and tone. Another tricky bit is just these edges of the robe. Very careful to load the right amount of paint so that we don't bleed onto our silver. I try to be really zen about this step, listening to music while I'm working. There's something about painting that I find kind of meditative. I get to shut off my inner dialogue and have some peace of mind. Which might seem ironic to you when you consider what I was listening to. I was listening to death metal during most of this. So soothing. Alright, lower part of the robes are done. For the upper part of the robes, we'll be using Grim Black Speed Paint by the Army Painter. Turning my palette and starting with the next available slot. We'll get just the right amount on our brush, and now we're just painting in our upper part of our robes. Now I gotta say I like Grim Black, but I don't love it. I feel like the finish is somewhat inconsistent. Do you guys have a favorite black contrast paint? Let me know in the comments. I do try to be a little careful here because this is a very strong color. It is definitely more of a very dark gray. The recesses are going to be darkened even further in the next steps. Now for cloth, the stuff seems to work pretty well, but I couldn't imagine it working on something like a Space Marine. Alright, upper part of the robes are done. We are almost done with our speed painting. Now we're painting our leather pouch with hardened leather. Always roll our tips. This paint is perfect for painting pouches. Even if I'm not using a speed paint for most of my model, I tend to use it for things like this. Feels like almost every model has leather pouches. Alright, next we're painting the teeths and the claws. Breaking out my wet palette, we'll be using Pro Acryl Ivory. I'm using a very small brush here, but it's kind of overkill. If you have a sharp tip, it should be good enough. Just painting all the teeth and claws. This is another instance where it's very important not to overload your brush. Besides not getting in the ferrule, it keeps it from running into places where you don't want it and helps you maintain control. Now here I'm painting the claws on one of the feet, but you're going to have to take my word for it. Yep, those are claws. Not 100% necessary, but I do pick out the claws on his hands as well. For the next step, I'm using Pro Acryl Magenta to paint his tongue. That was way too much magenta. Maybe if I was painting 40 clan rat tongues. For my simple bases, I'm using a Grelin Earth, laid on thick to get the best crackle results. Now I decided the shield looked a bit empty, so I decided to freehand a Skaven icon on there. I'm just using the ivory from earlier. Now this rune of the Great Horned Rat doesn't have to be perfect. Just roughly sketch the 3 lines to make the symbol. I decided to line the icon in black using Pro Acryl Coal Black as well. Now I didn't quite like the consistency on my first pass of the black, so I waited for it to dry and I came back with a second pass. It's a good idea when fixing mistakes to make sure the previous layer has dried completely. Don't worry about mistakes, the only real mistake you can make is to stop painting. Black lining is done. Now we could call it good here, but the next step is what really makes this technique pop. It's time to oil wash. For our oil wash, we'll be using Burnt Umber and Ivory Black, which we'll be thinning with our mineral spirits. Our goal is to thin this out to a wash consistency. Think Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade. Mix thoroughly until all the lumps of oil paint are gone, and run your brush up the side to test the consistency. Now for speed painting, I use this differently than if I'm painting for display. For these clan rats, I'm going to kind of just slop it all over the model. Because one of the great things about these oil washes is we can remove from areas we don't want. This is kind of a subtractive process where we go in after it's dry and remove progressive amounts of oil off the top. This will give us the impression of highlights that aren't really there and do it fast. We can use our brush also to wick away any excess. We wait a little bit over an hour and we're ready to remove. Using a dry makeup sponge, I start to remove the upper layers of oil. Play this by ear, remove as much as you feel like you want. If you want your model to look more dingy or grimy, leave more on. For example, if you were painting a Plague Monk or a Plague Marine. Next, I'm going back to the mineral spirits, adding 1 drop to our makeup sponge. This is going to really bring out the upper levels of highlights. You can see the vibrancy of the poppy red coming back. Also, you can see the impression of highlights that we never made on the skin. This is where an oil wash is way better than an acrylic wash because you can remove as much as you like. You basically get a wash and a highlight in one step. So here he is after the cleanup. Really a perfectly serviceable tabletop standard here. Using this method, I can churn out a ton of clan rats. Now he is still quite shiny, so we're going to bump that down with a matte varnish. My preferred brand is Liquitex. You do have to shake them extremely well, but I find one bottle lasts me ages. Through the airbrush, we're just going to slowly coat him until we see that shine knocked back down. Going back to my coal black, I'm going to paint that base rim. How about you guys? What color do you guys paint your base rims? Before using black, I used brown. I tried matching the color of the base itself. And when I first started painting, of course, everything was goblin green.
Ugh. Brother, ugh. What's that?
We're more civilized now. Gonna quickly throw on a tuft. Now let's be real here. A Grelin Earth and tufts is gonna one day be our goblin green, am I right?
Why would you say something so controversial yet so brave?
Alright, here's our model painted to a nice tabletop standard and done quite fast. If you're happy with this, you can stop right here. But if you want your rats to be on par with the ones I showed you earlier, we need to do a couple more quick steps. I feel like these couple of steps add enough punch to the model to be worth it. This involves edge highlighting the silver in a brighter tone, painting the eyes, highlighting the claws and teeth, and the skin. For the metal, I'll be using Vallejo Metal Color Silver. Alright, we're highlighting the upper levels of the metal where the light would hit. I find that the speed paint metallics are not quite as shiny as traditional metallics, and Vallejo Metal Color Silver is one of the brightest, shiniest metallic silvers I've found. So we're going to be carefully edge highlighting the shield as well, carefully picking out the rivets and the edges of the metal. Lastly, we're going to be highlighting the chainmail. This really brings back the vibrancy of the metal and really sells it as metallic. To paint the eyes, I'm bringing out the 000 brush, and I'll be using bold Pyrrole Red, Orange, and Golden Yellow from Pro Acryl. When working with such a small brush, it's important to have a very thin paint, otherwise the tip will just dry out. Painting eyes is something that I haven't always felt comfortable doing. If you do it wrong, your models will just look unhinged.
Space Marines, attack!
Kill me!
Never forget, this was an official GW model.
Maybe I am insane. Maybe I am insane. And maybe it's time for you to find out how insane I am.
Okay, maybe that works for Katachan. Alright, dipping into our orange. Now we're dotting our eye and covering slightly less than the previous layer. In order to stabilize myself when painting such small details, I keep my elbows down on my table, and I also stabilize my hands against each other. Going in for the yellow, and this time painting just the very, very tip of the eye. I like the way that this effect looks, and it's how I paint my Tyranid eyes as well. But for batch painting, feel free just to paint one color. Maybe you prefer red Skaven eyes, or maybe just pure yellow. Next, we're going to use Pro Acryl Bright Ivory to highlight the teeth and claws. For the skin highlight, we're back to Tan Flesh and Pale Pink by Pro Acryl. Doing about a 50-50 blend of each. Making sure it has the right consistency. And I'm just edge highlighting the uppermost edges of the ear, the cheekbones, the eyebrows, and the nose. Sorry again for the focus here. I believe I need to stop using autofocus and switch to manual focus. Also highlighting things like the back of his heel and the ridges on the tail. Don't worry if it seems too extreme at first. Once it dries, it's going to mellow out. You'll see on the finished model. Again, getting the nose, the cheekbones, and eyebrows on the other side of the face, along with the top of the ear. And also the top of his head, anywhere that would be more brightly lit. And here we are, we have our finished model. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, leave me a comment, let me know what you want to see next on the channel. Let's give him the same treatment we gave his brothers. Coming soon, I'll be using this method to paint the entire Skaven half of the Skaventide set, and do it as fast as possible. I'll also be airbrushing some Vespids, and speed painting some Tempestus Aquilans, all from the Kill Team 3rd edition set. What are you waiting for? Go paint some rats!
Spellcasting!
Bye.